Good morning, everyone, and a very warm welcome to the first of 3 instalments in our webinar series on mainstreaming property flood resilience, which has been generously supported by White House Construction. I'm Terry Fuller. I'm the Chief Executive at CIWEM, the Chartered Institution of Water and Environmental Management. For those who aren't familiar with CIWEM, welcome to you. We're a Royal Chartered professional institution representing a community of thousands of water and environmental management professionals and across the world. At CIWEM, our vision is a safer, sustainable world. We are all about working in an integrated way, bringing multidisciplinary skill sets to bear on the really knotty, multi-dimensional challenges that exist in the midst of the climate, nature, and sustainable emergencies. So if we're new to you, and you to us, and you like today's event, do get in touch. We'd be delighted to hear from you, and we'll share details about how you can do that later on. Now, property flood resilience is one of those multidisciplinary interventions that needs all kinds of skill sets and interests to come together and work together to deliver desired outcomes. Flood risk assessors, building surveyors, engineers, architects, ecologists, loss adjusters, insurers, builders, installers, and of course, the property occupiers. It's really complex. PFR, property flood resilience, is an approach which has developed over the past decade or so and is now recognised as a vital management option for residual flood risk, where other interventions are either not able to reduce levels of flood risk to acceptable levels, or where they're not affordable. In the early days, the focus was quite squarely on resistance. That's trying to prevent or at least reduce the amount of flood water which might enter a property during a flood event. Then there was a growing recognition that this approach had limitations, and in fact, there would always be circumstances where water would enter a property. So the focus needed to also be on reducing the damage caused when it did, and dramatically shrinking the amount of time a resident or business would be out of their property after waters recede. In other words, recoverability. So from property level protection to property flood resilience, this is an approach, an industry which has evolved and developed and grown. But as we look to the future, we face, with climate change, a picture of increasing winter rainfall and more intense storms, both in winter and summer. The last winter, we saw record flows in many of our rivers, condition described as not normal, or dare I say, the new normal. Thousands of properties were flooded and far too many people forced out of their homes for weeks and months. It can sometimes run into years, with all the attendant stress, financial hardship, dislocation of families, and of social support networks that comes with these events and their aftermath. And then, of course, for some, that experience coincided with lockdown under the coronavirus pandemic, leading to an even more horrendous experience. What was, of course, less reported was the number of properties which, due to the work of the Environment Agency and other risk management authorities, protected during the winter floods. Many thousands of people didn't flood because of the works undertaken over the past decade or so. But it's unrealistic to expect that everyone can be protected in this way. Flooding can happen in an incredibly wide range of places. The vagaries of our weather introduces an unpredictability which can be exceedingly hard to second guess. So we need to be prepared for all kinds of events and all kinds of levels of risk. Flooding will continue to happen. PFR is part of this preparedness. We have a growing and maturing industry. It has been supported by standards and a code of practice, and supporting guidance is due to be published later this year. We have an insurance industry that is increasingly supporting building back better, resilient repair to flooded properties. Currently, we have Flood Re, a scheme which supports homeowners who are unable to obtain affordable open market flood insurance. But that scheme will end in the early 2040s, and there are tens of thousands of homes which will potentially need to have resilience measures installed to a reliable standard to enable them to recover quickly after a flood with minimal damage in order to be insurable on the open market. We need to mainstream PFR to install resilience measures far more widely in order to manage this future. The Environment Agency has a framework programme installing schemes in places where it represents the most appropriate approach to reducing risk, and is testing different approaches in different locations through its PFR Pathfinders. Insurers are coming on board. Communities are increasingly recognising the benefits, and there is a growing body of great examples of where resilience is working and helping people to recover quickly after floods. But we need to up the pace and scale. And this is what this webinar series is all about. Across the next 3 Tuesday mornings, we'll be looking at the experiences and priorities of local and national government, of property owners, of businesses and insurers. We'll be looking at the code of practice and how installers will work with it. And we'll be asking, where do we need to go next? What do we need to prioritise? Now this week, to kick things off, we have 4 great speakers for you. Firstly, I'm really delighted that the Environment Agency Chair, Emma Howard-Boyd, will open things for us with a look back at the winter floods and an overview of where PFR sits for the agency within that mosaic of flood and coastal erosion risk management measures. Following on from Emma, we have Steve Wragg, who's kindly joining us from City of York Council to give us a more local flavour of how events over the recent years have affected York and Yorkshire, and how PFR is being taken forward there. I'm also pleased that we're joined by Robbie Craig from Defra to talk about the government's priorities for encouraging and enabling wider uptake. And of course, we anticipate the flood and coastal erosion risk management policy statement in due course, which will hopefully help to spur the momentum we all want to achieve. Finally today, Martin Hurst is going to give us the benefit of his perspective as a resilient homeowner, a show and tell of how it can be done and all the lessons learned along the way. Before we launch into our talks this morning, a quick bit of housekeeping. We'll be splitting this 2-hour session into 2 halves. We'll hear from our first 2 speakers, and after each we will take questions from you, the audience. We want you, the audience, to pose the questions to our speakers as well as to see and comment on what other people are asking. So we'll be using the Slido platform to let you ask questions or vote on those others. So vote on those that others have posted, if you'd really like them to be put forward to our speakers. So please go to www.slido.com using your smartphone or your other device, and you need to enter the code MPFR, and you should see coming up on the screen a QR code, which is the far easier way of doing it. So if you have a phone, you just go to the camera setting, place that in front of the QR code, and it will all happen automatically. I promise you, it's magic. So you can submit your questions within the Q&A section on Slido at any time during the presentation, and hit the thumbs up button to promote the questions submitted by others. You can also interact with each other and comment on any active questions in Slido by hitting reply underneath the question. If you can't use Slido right now, don't worry. We'll display the results and the most voted for questions on the screen during the questions. We also have a short poll which is running on Slido too. 5 questions, which we hope you'll take a couple of minutes to answer. The poll will stay live during the event, but also for the rest of the day if you want to go on later. So after Emma and Steve have spoken and taken questions, at 10 o'clock, we'll have a short 5-minute comfort break and return for Robbie and Martin in the same format. And we'll wrap up at 11 o'clock sharp. So now, without further ado, it's time for me to introduce to you our first speaker, Emma Howard-Boyd. who's the chair of the Environment Agency, an ex officio board member of the Department of the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, Defra, and UK Commissioner to the Global Commission on Adaptation. Emma serves on a number of boards and advisory committees, which include Manhattan PLC, the Prince's Accounting for Sustainability Project, and the European Climate Foundation. Emma has worked in financial services for over 25 years in corporate finance and fund management. And may I also just say, every occasion that I've heard Emma speak, she speaks with real passion and care about the communities and the people who are at the sharp end of everything that we're going to be talking about today. So Emma, it's a real pleasure to have you on our webinar this morning. Thank you very much, and over to you.
Great, and hopefully you can hear me okay. Terry, thank you very much for that kind introduction. Yesterday was World Oceans Day. World Oceans Day is a moment to celebrate the beauty and wildlife of the sea. It's a moment to commit to do more to protect it by using less plastic or fewer chemicals on agricultural land. But there's another side to our relationship with oceans. The National Maritime Museum in Falmouth celebrates this country's extraordinary achievements at sea. Just outside it is a plaque with a quote from the great 19th century author Joseph Conrad. It says, "The sea has never been friendly to man. At most, it has been the accomplice of human restlessness." It's appropriately placed because while we celebrate all that we have achieved with nature, we would do well to remember that nature always has the power to humble us. Perhaps the message is Britain might rule the waves, but the waves don't care. This year, the world has been grappling with the terrible impacts of the coronavirus pandemic. The pandemic has changed a lot, but it has not stopped the rain from falling or the sea level from rising. And so these risks overlap like the surf on a beach. February 2020 was England's wettest ever, and it was the 5th wettest of any calendar month since 1862. When the Met Office produced rainfall data, their maps usually record up to 200% of average rainfall. For February, they had to create a new scale above 400% for some areas. Of the 5.3 million properties at risk of flooding in England, 0.08% were flooded, a devastating experience for those affected. While the coronavirus crisis has been ongoing, many people will still be living with the physical aftermath of this winter, as well as dealing with the challenges of the pandemic and the lockdown. Since the mid-18th century, winters have been getting warmer and wetter. Last year, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change said once a century sea level events will be annual events by 2050. That not only threatens the coastline, it also makes it more difficult for floodwater to escape out to sea. It's easy to feel overwhelmed by these trends. But while we hope not to encounter the perfect storm, we must plan as though we can see it on the horizon. On Friday, Nigel Topping and Gonzalo Munoz, the UN high-level climate champions for the UK and Chile, launched the Race to Zero. Ahead of COP26, the campaign will bring together the largest ever coalition of businesses, investors, cities and regions committed to achieving net zero emissions by 2050, in line with the scientific consensus on limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Dr. Maria Naira, speaking at the event, she's the Director of Environment, Climate Change and Health at the World Health Organization, said, like never before, the world has gathered around one goal: the race to zero deaths from COVID-19. A healthy recovery from this pandemic means we need to continue and expand this race to zero deaths from climate change and environmental pollution. A race to zero people pushed into poverty because of health costs, to zero people breathing polluted air. If we want to recover from COVID-19, we all need to embark on a race to zero emissions. I agree, it's a race we all need to win. But even if we manage it, there are many escalating impacts of the climate emergency that are already locked into the system. So perhaps we also need a race to resilience. Like sustainability a decade ago, resilience is a word that currently risks being overused. However, it does express exactly what we mean when we talk about how people should approach the climate impacts of the future. When we talk about resilience, we are talking about enabling lives to be lived and planned comfortably alongside the weather impacts. That includes immediate and medium-term protections for communities, but it also means better warning and informing, the ability to return to normal quickly after a flood, and building back better where we can't. February 2020 was record-breaking, but our baseline should be records that have not yet been broken, not what happened in the past, however recent or extraordinary. Soon the Environment Agency will publish our flood strategy. This will set out practical measures to be implemented by risk management authorities, partners and communities, which will contribute to longer-term delivery objectives and our vision: a nation ready for and resilient to flooding and coastal change today, tomorrow, and to the year 2100. The strategy has three core ambitions concerning future risk and investment needs. Firstly, climate resilient places, working with partners to bolster resilience to flooding and coastal change across the nation, both now and in the face of climate change. Secondly, today's growth and infrastructure resilient in tomorrow's climate, making the right investment and planning decisions to secure sustainable growth and environmental improvements, as well as resilient infrastructure. And thirdly, a nation ready to respond and adapt to flooding and coastal change, ensuring local people understand their risk to flooding and coastal change and know their responsibilities and how to take action. As everyone looks to rebuild and renew after the coronavirus pandemic, this strategy will help to ensure a clean, green recovery with sustainability and natural processes at its heart. It is not only about risk avoidance. There's a world of social and economic opportunities in helping communities to protect against, manage, and build back better following the physical impacts of climate change. This country's domestic experience and expertise in flood and coastal risk management protects millions of people every year and is internationally sought after. For every pound spent on protecting communities from flood, we avoid around £5 in property damages. This February, Environment Agency flood schemes around the country protected over 128,000 properties, even though water levels were higher than the summer floods of 2007, when 55,000 properties flooded. We will continue to build on this. It was welcome news that the Chancellor announced £5.2 billion of capital funding in the budget to better protect 336,000 properties, including homes, businesses and hospitals. But the Environment Agency cannot guarantee a world without flooding. We can only reduce the risks in some places. People also need to take measures to protect their own properties. Property level flood resilience refers to measures that can be put in a property to reduce the risk and impact so that people get back into their homes or business premises quicker after a flood. Examples include installing non-return valves on waste pipes, air brick covers, using flood-resistant coatings on walls, raised electrics, hard flooring, and using flood barriers to stop water coming through doorways. These measures have the potential to reduce flood risk to homes and businesses and help them recover much more quickly than more conventional construction. The Environment Agency's long-term investment scenarios estimate that property-level flood resilience has the potential to reduce national flood risk by about 16%, which means around 200,000 homes in England. It can also be used for those who can't benefit from other forms of managing flood risk, often individual or small groups of homes. However, like any other intervention, it comes with a warning. Property level flood resilience can be exceeded, usually by flood depths greater than 600 millimetres. We are spending around £3.6 million on resilient measures between 2015 and 2021. Last year, we worked with Mary Dunno to develop and publish a new e-publication on property level flood resilience. It brings together case studies of homes, business and flood groups that have installed resilience measures. And we have recently commissioned a second edition that will illustrate how such installations have performed following the recent winter flooding. Also last year, 3 Pathfinder projects were allocated funding up to £700,000 to boost research into and uptake of property level measures. The three projects are the Yorkshire Future Flood Resilience Pathfinder project led by the City of York Council, Oxford-Cambridge Pathfinder led by Northamptonshire County Council, and Southwest Partnership project led by Cornwall County Council. The funding will go towards new research initiatives and demonstration centres and advice portals, which will help people to learn about the benefits of installing measures in their homes. In February, a property flood resilience code of practice was launched to raise national standards. The project was funded by Aviva, the Environment Agency, Welsh Government, the Department for Infrastructure, and Scottish Government. The Code of Practice will give industry and consumers a comprehensive guide to the specification and installation of property level flood resilience. It will also provide some minimal requirements that will create a new benchmark. If property flood resilience is applied with greater consistency, this will give confidence to property owners and their insurers. I began this speech talking about how we need to be humble before nature. We have learnt a lot about the limitations of humanity this year, but we have also found out much about our strengths. Resilience is about acknowledging that while we can't hold back the tide 100% of the time, we can put in measures to ensure that when the water level recedes, we return to our homes, our businesses, and our lives as quickly as possible. In doing that, we can continue to look upon the sea as a thing of beauty as much as a force to be reckoned with. Thank you very much.
Emma, that's wonderful. Thank you very much for that indeed. I have to say I'm really excited about the strategy and really just getting moving, really getting the industry mobilised to take the strategy forward. So thank you for characterising it in the way that you have. We're going to go to some questions for you now. But just while we gather ourselves around that, I just wanted to ask a question myself, if that's allowed. So we know that one of the main objectives of the strategy is that we create climate resilient places. And so I'm just wondering, really, what's your view on how widespread you think the use of PFR, property flood resilience, needs to be in order to achieve that climate resilient place objective?
Trying to come off mute quickly, and apologies for the building work that's going on in the background. Hopefully that's not coming through too loudly. I think we all know that we need every tool in the box to deal with the flood risk that we're facing, and there is no doubt the property level resilience needs to be part of that. I think it also needs to be part of the future too. So we need to make sure that the mix is correct. I talked about our economic assessments, and that we reckon about 16% of protection comes through property level resilience, but it has to be a mix, and it has to be built into all of the future development that we're doing. So key to it, but we know that we have to look at flooding from every single perspective and make sure that the measures, the mosaic that you referred to, are complementary and join right from the start too, of making sure that we are warning and informing and allowing people to think about their lives as well. And that's why I think that has to be an emphasis too. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for that. I completely agree with that latter point. I think that there is a big part of this of enabling people to be empowered to have some kind of control over how this impacts their lives and how people can live with flooding, learn to live with flooding. Thank you very much. Okay, so we have quite a few questions actually that have come through on Slido. The first one is a perennial question about houses constantly being built on floodplains. Why is this being allowed, and what can be done to stop this? It seems counterintuitive. We could probably have a whole webinar, I think, on this topic, but do you have any sort of thoughts you'd like to share with us, Emma, around that question?
I think one of the things that I have been encouraged by is the join up of discussions that are now taking place at a very, very senior level around the issue of climate change and the systemic risk that we all face. And I think this is something that our Secretary of State, if you remember back to February, he was appointed literally as we went into a period of severe flooding, has also been addressing. I think we, as the Environment Agency, you know that we have we're a statutory, we comment and have to give advice on new housing. I think one of the things that we need to look at is the enforcement of that advice as a statutory consultee, because we know that we work very closely with local authorities and planning in terms of the way households are built, if they are built in the floodplain. And let's face it, if you think of London, it is in the floodplain. We have put in measures such as the Thames barrier, etc., that allow development to take place. But what we need to make sure is when advice has been given about building resiliently, that there is enforcement behind that advice in all sorts of planning regimes and advice. We need to make sure that it is actually delivered. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, and I wasn't kidding, perhaps we do need to look at a webinar series around that particular topic and land use planning, etc. It's huge, and it's, as you say, it's very, very important intrinsic part of the challenges we face. So no debate around flood risk management would be complete without talking about funding. And our next question is actually recognising that the UK has a huge challenge, economic challenge ahead of us, there's no doubt about that. And this all comes on the back of fairly recent announcements that government will be providing additional funding into the flood risk budget. So the question here is, how do you feel the huge cost of the COVID-19 impacts will impact on the future available flooding for flood resilience?
So one of the things that I have been working on throughout this period of the coronavirus pandemic is how we as different organisations and as business leaders work on the green recovery. And I do see that there is a huge opportunity for the green recovery to also focus on climate change, resilience, and nature-based solutions. So our working assumption is that the funding that was allocated to us on flood delivery in the budget is still going to happen, but equally, as money is put into the recovery, there is an opportunity to make sure that we are working with others to embed resilience into all of those projects. And I think that is something that we all need to put our effort behind. And again, join up the dots. One of the things that I have been saying a lot over recent years, given my background in investment, is what is the point of investing in things like energy efficiency or renewables if they wash away in a flood or melt in a heat wave? I think we have a real opportunity to make sure that as we move into the recovery, we think about how not only do we work with government spending, but leverage in money from the private community. And just last week, we announced 4 tiny projects, 2 of which were in the natural flood management space with Defra, with Esme Fairbairn, the charitable foundation, and with Triodos Bank, where we are looking at how we can build the investment and business model to leverage in investment to make sure that the money that we have to spend on those sorts of projects is actually multiplied. Thank you.
Thank you, Emma. And you mentioned in your presentation the sort of 5-to-1 return that we get from flood risk investment in the economy, and I personally think that may even be an underestimate. Actually, the benefits that this has to helping the economy to recover and also to thrive and grow. And I think what you just said there leads us nicely into the next question, and this is something which CIWEM is looking to help to tackle and provide influence over. And it's around the question of, do you think the building regulations should be changed to include flood resilience, so to drive flood resilience into properties through the building regs?
I think that is another area that we need to look closely at alongside other climate change and safety measures. Absolutely.
Okay, thank you. Okay, staying with funding and money, etc. The regional management authorities, flood authorities, we know that they're struggling to achieve funding for schemes. And the question here is, what measures are in place to help tackle surface water flooding, as it is far more sporadic than tidal and river flooding?
I think that is again a really important issue for us to work together with. As I think you know, Terry, we have a series of regional flood and coastal committees, and dealing with surface water flooding is very much on the agenda of these meetings. This is where you bring together the work of the Environment Agency with the department, with Defra, but also colleagues at a local and local authority level to look at all of the issues that we face around flooding. And again, making sure that we are joining the dots in terms of making people and communities resilient to the different ways that the water flows. I think it is also a key part of our strategy to look at the flip side of flooding, which is too little water as well. So one of our ambitions for the strategy, working with all of our partners up and down the country, is to make sure that we are looking at water and resilience to water stress, whether it's too much or too little, and the different forms at which that water stress may take, whether it's rainfall or indeed coming from rivers or the sea, to make sure that we are working with communities to build that long-term resilience. Thank you.
That's great, thank you very much. And of course, holistic water management is very much at the heart of CIWEM's remit. We're constantly trying to promote looking right the way across the water cycle and not just consider any particular aspect of it in isolation. So thank you for that answer. I'm afraid we're out of time for questions for Emma, but I can see on the screen there's lots in front of me. We will capture these questions, and just reading down some of them, they're like absolute gold dust to us at CIWEM, really. I think, you know, this gives us a really good steer in terms of what you're thinking and what the profession is seeking, and we will make use of these questions and provide feedback to you where we can. But for now, I'm afraid we have to move on. So I'd just like to say a massive thank you to you, Emma. I know you've got a very busy day ahead, so you're going to have to leave us shortly, but I really appreciate you taking the time out this morning to share your thoughts with us. So thank you very much.
And Terry, I'd love to know the questions, whether I can answer them all, but certainly either the other speakers will be able to address them, or we may be able to come back shortly with, particularly when we get to the stage where we are announcing our flood strategy imminently, we hope. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much. Okay, I'm going to move on now and introduce Steve Wragg. Steve has worked in flood risk management for over 20 years and has experienced the industry and its changes from a range of roles across this time. Steve worked for the Environment Agency for 12 years, then following the 2007 floods and the development of the lead local flood authorities, Steve took up the role of flood risk planning manager for Hull City Council. He then joined City of York Council in 2014. Steve has chaired the local authority capacity building steering group for the EA and Defra. He leads on skills and capacity development in the Yorkshire Regional Flood Coastal Committee, and is involved in a number of national flood risk initiatives and advisory groups. So without further ado, Steve, I think the slides have come up on the screen, and we will hand over to you to take us expertly through those. Thank you very much, Steve.
Thank you, Terry. Thank you for that introduction, and good morning to everyone wherever you're viewing this this presentation. I'm going to give a quick overview here on our experiences in the 2020 floods this year, but also looking back on some of the other recent events had here in York and across Yorkshire, and then give a bit more information on the role of property flood resilience and the work that we're doing across Yorkshire at the moment, but also just how we could really use those technologies moving forward. Next.
Great. So just a quick FYI, we're seeing your slideshow not in presentation. There we go.
There we go. Yeah, that's right. Wouldn't move on. Thank you, Jane. So now we're in full screen. There we go. Looking at it, I have my shopping list in the background. So York, many people will be aware of the flood events in York over the years. In the top right-hand corner of the screen, there's the King's Arms pub there, which many people will see on lots of media coverage of flooding in York, or stock flooding pictures for anywhere in the country. That's the year 2000. That was the biggest flood on record in York, where the River Hughes, which is in picture, reached 5.4 metres above the normal summer level, and affected many hundreds of properties on that occasion. But it's not a new thing in York. 1892 in the top left-hand corner, 1947, which was a big snowmelt flood event, and 1982 in the bottom right-hand corner, which was previously the biggest flood on record. The last major flood event in York, the Boxing Day 2015 floods, was the second biggest flood on record on the River Hughes. So the pictures were not dissimilar to those in the top right-hand corner. But it was the biggest flood on record on the River Foss, with record flows and volumes coming down the River Foss. And the Foss barrier was overwhelmed, its standard of protection was exceeded, and significant areas of the city were overwhelmed that had not been flooded for many years. And I'll touch on that in a few slides forward, because it's a key issue for us in the last few years. This is the Viking River recorder in York on the River Ouse. It's got a long gauging record going back to the late 1880s, as you can probably see on the screen there. So we've got a really good, consistent and reliable record of peak flows, daily, hourly peak flows, but this is the peak annual maximum flood from that gauging station over the period of late 1880s through to present day. And as you can see, there's a gradual rise in the average peak river level in York, about 8 millimetres a year rise in York we're observing. Some of the expectations that we've seen in York over a number of years, and these are probably not things that people have not seen elsewhere. It's not unique to York, I don't think. I think on the top left-hand corner, I'm going to run through pretty much all of these, but fairly quickly on some and dwell on a few others. In the top left-hand corner there, social media demands on responders. I think this is a really, really key issue for all of us. I think the proliferation of social media over the recent years means that during an event, during a crisis, people turn to social media and post different hashtags on Twitter or Instagram or the likes, or set up individual Facebook groups during the response or perhaps the recovery phase. And it's really, really difficult for local authorities, the Environment Agency, Blue Light Services to really understand exactly what's happening out there in the world of social media as to where all these different threads are. But really the expectations of whomever is posting on those social media formats are expecting responses and answers. People don't really know that those things exist. It's really difficult. And one of the lessons we learned after the Boxing Day 2015 floods was our communications team has really done a lot of work to go out there and map all of the existing groups that are there in the communities across York to try to understand where the different routes and sources of information will come from in the next major flood event. Personalised responses are expected. By that I mean often people don't want to be reliant on mass communications, flood warnings. The flood warnings by the Environment Agency are an extremely useful tool, certainly in York where we get a good forecast and advanced knowledge of flooding. But people expect to knock on the door from someone in a fluorescent text, is my experience. And people don't always feel the need to sign up for a flood warning, which is a couple of points down there. It'll never happen again. Everyone seems to pin floods on this esoteric thing that happens with a very high likelihood of it, unlikelihood of it happening, and that it'll never happen again. It was unprecedented rainfall that led to a major event. But as we know, these events, today's extreme events will be tomorrow's more frequent events, and we need to get people to understand that they need to be prepared for future flooding. We get the warnings all of the time. That's a bit of potential. Whenever there's been the cry wolf situation where the forecasts haven't quite predicted what actually happened, and we issue flood warnings or messaging from local authorities or the Blue Light Services and things didn't happen, people become complacent and don't respond to those warnings. We want sandbags now. Well, I'll just leave that one out there. People see the sandbag as the great silver bullet to prevent all flooding, and as we know, they're not the solution. I'm not sure if Mary Donna's on this meeting, but she would certainly jump up and down and say that that's not the case. You did not do enough. There's always more that people expect. No one told us it would happen. Now, over the years, when I joined the Environment Agency, we talked about flood defence, and then we moved to flood risk management, and now we're talking about flood resilience. And the communications and messaging and mapping and forecasting has grown exponentially over that period. There is a lot of information out there about flood risk, but people just are not always aware of this. Where were the council? Where were any authorities? We get these questions after a flood, despite us being able to compile significant investigations of what happened and all of the things that were done by all the different responders. It should never be allowed to happen again. People expect answers, they expect capital works, they expect things put in place to prevent things ever happening again. We can't stop all floods, as Emma said. We cannot remove the risk in all circumstances. So it's about people understanding that residual risk of things potentially happening again, and how we can work together to reduce that residual risk to as minimum as possible, while still understanding that, you know, there could be the impacts of future floods on that community. We want answers now. There's always a clamour as soon as the rainfall starts to fall, that people want to understand what's going to happen, what will be the issues and how will it impact on them. But then the answers immediately after a flood. Why did it happen? And roles and responsibilities there. I joined the industry in the late 90s, and every single flood event we've had anywhere in the country, the investigation always talks about the lack of understanding of roles and responsibilities between the EA and government, local authorities, the blue light services, the water and sewage companies, internal drainage boards. And, you know, we in the industry understand where those limitations are and how we need to work together. And we do, certainly in York and across Yorkshire in general, I can talk, you know, with great certainty that we do work very closely together. But that's not always understood by the general public or by others that are wanting us to work together to resolve flood risk issues into the future. There we go. So 2020 floods in York, the February 2020 floods, was planned resilience versus plan B. And I've used that phrase carefully. In York and the River Ouse, and again, you can see the King's Arms pub in the background there. We understand the levels that will be achieved in York with the forecasting that's available, and we can plan in advance our flood plans internally in the council, the flood plans that the Environment Agency have, all work with the different trigger levels from the different warnings and the forecasts. And in February 2020, all of our operations were in place. The Environment Agency flood defences were in operation, and all worked extremely well. We did carry out some temporary works in certain locations to extend the reach of those measures. But on the whole, it worked to the plan. We were able to communicate to that plan. And the 4 flood peaks that we observed in 2020 in York, you know, all passed with relatively little impact on properties. The properties that were affected were pretty much to the whole resilient. They understood past flooding, they understood the impacts of past flooding, and they'd taken measures themselves, or potentially via some capital schemes that have been put in place by various risk management authorities in the city, but also by the grant processes that have been put in place in previous years, and I'm sure Robbie will elaborate on that after the break. The difference between that and the right-hand side of your screen there, where you can see an evacuation exercise, that was Plan B in my phraseology. That was Boxing Day 2015. The Foss Barrier standard protection was overwhelmed. An area of housing, and there were 630 properties flooded in Boxing Day 2015, and the vast majority, almost all of them, were behind the barrier. That area had not suffered any flooding since the 1982 floods, which was one of the examples I showed earlier on. The Foss Barrier had controlled river levels in that area from the late 80s when it was finished under construction. So people's understanding of the residual risk of their properties was absolutely rock bottom. People weren't prepared and just didn't have the awareness to understand how they could be affected. But Plan B, you know, were kicked in a major way, as you can see. So from the Civil Command Control Centre, you know, myself and Blue Light Services, the EA, Yorkshire Water, etc., were all involved in a minute-by-minute, hour-by-hour escalating response to really minimise the impacts of flooding on those communities. So I've chosen those words carefully, planned resilience versus Plan B, because they were really our experiences, certainly between the Boxing Day 2015 floods and the February 2020 floods. But over a number of years, we can see how we can manage a flood according to our plans very, very carefully until something goes outside of that and the Plan B type situation kicks in. There we go. So now touching on the Yorkshire Flood Resilience Pathfinder, which Emma mentioned earlier on. There's some details there in the top left-hand corner of the screen. They're one of 3 Pathfinder projects in the country, as Emma said, and all 3 of my project officers that are working on this are all on this presentation, so they'll be looking at any questions or comments very carefully, and you can get in touch with us there via a couple of routes. And our project is essentially the 3 project officers who are working for myself under the name of City of York Council, but really it's a Yorkshire Regional Flood and Coastal Committee project. And we have the ICASP, which is the University of Leeds led research consortium, and Jeremy Ben Associates Consulting are our evaluators on the project. And we're developing a range of different interventions, and our plan was, in this period now, through the summer into early next year, was to spend a lot of time, those 3 project officers, out in communities across Yorkshire, face-to-face awareness sessions, building people's understanding and knowledge of what property flood resilience is. Because unfortunately, it's still a concept that's not known to people. We've moved through the names of what it is too quickly. You know, we've had property level protection, property level resilience, and now we're on property flood resilience. And there's no wonder people don't understand what these concepts are. In addition to that, people don't want to make their homes resilient when they expect it to be something that's done to them rather than by them. Engineering projects that will keep the water at bay outside of the curtilage of their property, and people not wanting to have to accept that they can do things to their property themselves. That's not the experience in the whole. Those properties on the River Ouse, as I've shown in the last few shots, and obviously a presentation later on will show how we can build that acceptance and understanding of how floods will impact our properties. But we do need to keep that moving. You know, Defra and government have seen that it's been difficult to promote these ideologies over the years, and that's where the 3 Pathfinders come in. So because we can't spend a lot of time, because the current COVID restrictions face-to-face with people, we're really majoring on some of the remote aspects of the project. So developing training tools, online training environments, video training tools and presentations and blogs, and a range of different things. So if you do want to get in touch with the project officers, the details were on that last slide. But I'll also have them up on the end slide when I finish the presentation. And the sort of concepts that are in property flood resilience, it depends on the size of your screen, but there's a couple of materials that Mary Donna has produced that you may well have seen. At the top left-hand corner of the screen there is about residential properties. The bottom right-hand corner is about businesses. But I think we also need to think about wider resilience, planning-led property resilience. There was one of the questions after Emma spoke about why we continue building in floodplains. For me, and many in the industry, we understand and fully accept that. But as Emma said, our towns and our cities are built alongside rivers. They have been built alongside rivers for many years for the power that the water brought and the commerce and the transportation. And we can't turn our backs on that. And new developments will need to be built in riverine environments. They build, you know, the culture and the placemaking of those areas. So for me, it's about the right development within the floodplain. And these are 2 examples, nothing earth-shatteringly innovative there, but the habitable space above flood level and the undercross below the building are for car parking in these 2 examples, or for public realm or some other usage, where you still allow the floodplain to be used, but with development above or around that floodplain. And it can be done sensitively, and it can be done well. But I do completely understand those comments and questions about why are we still allowing this to happen. And if you scratch the surface, you can understand how it can be done in a sensitive way. We should have had, yep. But let's not forget surface water. One of the questions about surface water was great. It kind of gave me a link into this. In my opinion, property flood resilience provides the resilience inside the property. You know, this series of events, we'll be talking about that in great detail. But sustainable drainage, which has got the same stigmas and the same blockers for uptake that property flood resilience has within the wider drainage conversation. Sustainable drainage can support a resilient community in ensuring that that property plays its role in not passing on a surface water flood risk to those downstream. Extremely important concept, and we shouldn't sideline it and forget it when we think about property flood resilience. And that was my, oh no, one last slide, I think. Just a slide here, really, just with various things that are happening within the industry at the minute. We've had the kite mark over recent years. We've got the new flood and coastal erosion risk management strategy, as Emma identified there. The code of practice in the bottom right-hand corner. But just that top slide, which we'll hear from everyone today, and Emma certainly said it, we can't, no one authority can do it alone. But that missing jigsaw puzzle piece is definitely residual risk. We can get people to understand the concept of residual risk and that we can't defend against flood. There will be a future flood risk but we can all do something about it, then we will move this part of the industry forward. Thank you.
Steve, thank you ever so much. That's really fantastic, very comprehensive coverage there. We have got a couple of minutes before the break, so I'd like to go straight to questions that have come in from the delegates, and I'll take them in their order from the top. So the first question, Steve, is how can we empower the land/property owner to take responsibility to protect their assets from flooding, rather than the old view that the EA/local authority will sort it out? And that came through in your perceptions, didn't it? Questions that you put up. So how do you think we can convince them to take that responsibility?
I'll take anyone's answers on that and take them forward quite welcomely. Thank you very much. It's extremely difficult. I think we have seen the industry move forward slowly over the years. As I said, we've moved from flood defence through to flood risk management, you know, that aspect that we can't defend against all floods, and now the flood resilience mantra is there. We need to work very closely on a bespoke level with individual properties. It takes time and resource to embed, you know, relevant people within each community to actually take people on that discussion about, you know, firstly illustrating what the risk is to their property, then about what we can do. You know, everyone says, well, why can't we just control it at source, catchment scale interventions? You know, why do we need walls, and why do we need to put things against our property? It needs to be a shared conversation to illustrate those risks to people, how those risks are going to escalate into the future with you know, we've got the climate emergency agenda out there in many authorities, our authorities as well, and get people to understand how, you know, they can play a role as much as anyone else. But we need to incentivize it, you know, and the various grant schemes have really helped over the years that we've had. There's grant schemes out there at the minute after this winter's floods. And showing people how it can contribute to insurance is a really, really important one. And Flood Re is certainly doing a lot of work on that in the minute. And if we could get it where, you know, property flood resilience, we can show how people, if they can install it on their property, and you can see your premium start to drop in the same way as when you insure your car, and you can see that if you've got an alarm fitted, and you park it off street overnight, and all of these sort of things. When we get that brought into the industry, which, you know, as I say, Flood Re are working very hard to do that, we'll really see some step changes there. And there was also that question to Emma earlier on about why is it not in building regulations? And again, the Bonfield review after the 2007 really, really pushed on that. And I know some members of the Flood Resilience Roundtable are on this wider conference today, and they will certainly be nodding or shaking their heads respectfully about the work that they did to embed property flood resilience within the wider regulations governing building standards and building regulations. You know, and that's something that we'll all continue to push, because that would really be a step change as well.
Perfect, thank you. Steve, I'm going to skip the next question, because I think you've answered it. The question was about should we not put more emphasis on community engagement? I think you've just covered that in your previous answer. So we'll move on to final question, and I need you to be really brief, please, in response to it. So funding for property flood resilience is for a 20-year period. Are you concerned about the maintenance of PFR to ensure that they work for 20 years?
Yeah, it's something that we've observed over, you know, quite a number of years now. Property flood resilience is installed, and then, you know, people go back and we see that it's stored in the back of a garage with a bike up against it, or it's exposed to UV and it starts to degrade. You know, it's because it's not used all the time. It's something that's used, you know, once in a while, frankly. There are the potentials that it's not maintained. All the different locks and installation measures aren't checked, and the actual things themselves aren't carefully inspected. The new framework that the Environment Agency have put together for property flood resilience does take that step further. The post-installation survey, the post-installation information that's provided to the homeowner really does start to get the homeowner to understand how important the measures are and how they should look after them, maintain them, and look after them for that whole 20-year period. So that will be a good step change, but also the incentivization for insurance would really help there as well.
It's Spot on. That's great. Thank you very much, Steve. I'm afraid we're all out of time. The questions are on the screen here. As I said before, we will capture those and we'll attempt to either respond to them or embed them into future activities at CIWEM, so they won't get lost. I promise you that. Okay, so Steve, it just remains me to say thanks ever so much for taking us through that. We're going to go for a break now. Literally 5 minutes or maybe slightly under. So we need everyone back here at 10:05, please, after a quick comfort break. I look forward to seeing you then. Okay, thank you. Okay, welcome back, everybody. Our next speaker is Robbie Craig from Defra. Robbie has been a member of the flood and coastal erosion team at Defra since 2011. He works in the resilience and insurance team on property flood resilience policy and coastal erosion policy. Robbie has set up several initiatives within the team, the 2013 Community Pathfinder scheme, and most recently, the Property Flood Resilience Roundtable. Robbie also developed a PFR recovery scheme used in the 2013-14 and 2015-16 floods, and the current PFR Pathfinder scheme. He's also been able to commission research to underpin the use of PFR and the value of working with communities. Robbie, I'm really excited to hear what you have to say. So over to you now, please. You're on mute, Robbie.
Hopefully you can hear me now. Sorry about that. Automatically goes on to mute, I think, so I don't say anything embarrassing. Hello, everyone. As you've just heard, I work on property flood resilience policy in Defra. I have to warn you in advance that one of the things that I'm not able to do at the moment is to give you any kind of updates on what our new policy is going to be. We are going to later this year publish a policy setting out our position on flooding, and that will also be, and then the Environment Agency probably says a bit afterwards. So that's not fully been agreed by ministers yet, so I can't talk about that at this moment. But I can give you a general picture about the work that we're doing in this area. One of the things that people have brought up is the human impact of flooding, and the role of property flood resilience is really important in this area. We looked at this a few years ago, and here's some slides from what other people have said. And what we found was that where people were looking at PFR, they didn't really think about it before they were flooded. And this is because it's not mainstreamed, and this is kind of what this meeting today about is about how can we get it so it's like buying a burglar alarm. And one of the other things that was quite interesting is when we talked to people who had taken it up, was kind of what made them do it. And there was a bizarre kind of feeling where some people felt that they didn't know it wanted to work, but they wanted to fight back. And this is kind of a very powerful message that kept coming out of people we were speaking to, is that the people who adopted PFR did not want to be victims. They wanted to be able to fight back against flooding, and that's kind of one of the levers I think that we need to make more of when we start to try and get people to take up PFR. And we also have to remember PFR is part of a bigger picture, and it will include community level defences, but we have to be aware that PFR is there for those floods that overtop, for those places where the community flood levels schemes aren't appropriate. And there's been an excellent scheme developed by the Environment Agency on the Upper Medway to where there's 5 rivers meet in one location, and there's been lots of flooding in the past. So it's one of the things, it's not going to be the full answer to flooding, but it is the one that I think is going to make most difference to people's lives. What I would like to see is that property flood resilience becomes one of those things that when people have the opportunity to do any renewal, replacement, refurbishment of their homes, and they know they're in a flood risk area, that they actually think, you know what, I should use this material, this waterproof cementatious plaster, rather than the material I would normally buy. It's a bit more expensive, but it means if there's a flood, I won't be so damaged. But how do we get there? And that's kind of one of the things that Steve's been talking about, is this wider messaging, and how do we get people to sort of understand that they have a role to play in taking forward flood resilience. One of the things that I did quickly before we started before this talk was to have a quick tot up of what we've done through various government schemes for property flood resilience. And going back to 2008, when we first did our pilot schemes and our demonstration schemes and various other things before this property flood resilience became part of the partnership funding and scheme in 2012, we think there's about 5,000 properties out there who've had their flood resilience improved through government grants. And the other area where there's been a vast uptake of property flood resilience has been after big serious flood events. So 2013-14 and 2015-16, the government launched a recovery scheme to try and encourage people to integrate property flood resilience into how their property is repaired. And over those two events, there's about 17,000 people or properties actually taking up property flood resilience through that. So that's a clear sign that there is out there a kind of demand for these measures, and we need to be able to get to this point where it's not just after a flood event that people think about it. So going back to my earlier point, we need to get to people when opportunities arise in their lives to make changes, that they actually think of these changes as part of what they do. And some of our projects have actually looked at this and worked with local warehouses and places like that to actually develop products that people can put forward. And one of the great things is that our system now with partnership funding does take account better of the impact on people's mental health of flooding, and this should help more uptake of PFR in the long term, because clearly this is about giving people the tools and the ability to act. So this is kind of where I see PFR as role. I think we all know these things, but the thing I wanted to mention here basically was that the Property Flood Resilience Roundtable, because I think this has been one of the most important achievements that we've got off the ground, basically. And I think that what it actually does is it socializes this problem across a wide sector of the interested professionals. And I think better than just simply the government saying you will do this, it actually finds different and enduring ways to embed it into businesses. Now, it's not going to be an instant change, and progress has not been as rapid perhaps as one might have hoped, but it's an interesting group, and it's 34 people from various areas, from the private sector and independent trade and professional groups. It meets 3 to 4 times a year, and it's done some excellent work. We have the code of practice as a result of this group. This group's also been involved in creating the new British Standard and the web portal, and we now have a range of demonstration properties in Cumbria and at Watford, which actually people can go and look at these things. And it was great to see the way that the professional sectors responded, with people like CIWEM, RIBA and RICS, all kind of taken on board the need to update message with PFR and to make things and to work with their professionals. And of course, there are insurers out there who now offer grants to people who want to install property flood resilience. So things are starting to change, and it's about how we can get that wider change now to make things happen. And this was one of the reasons that we came up with the Pathfinder projects as a way of kind of taking this down to a local level. And I won't repeat what Steve said, but that they are excellent ways of working. And I hope that when the COVID restrictions are released, that the projects are able to get out there and to get things happen, to make things happen again. Now, the next slide is very busy, and I want to warn you about this. It's going to hurt your eyes when you see it. No, sorry, wrong slide. Anyway, I just put this one in for property flood resilience, resistance and recoverability to try and stress what we are trying to get at. As has been said previously, we started off resistance and we now go to recoverability. I think I see recoverability, which is something we champion through our post-flood recovery schemes, as a better way of protecting people, as it's less dependent on human activity. But there are significant behavioural barriers to this, and because there is a feeling of people after a flood, they just want to start again when they see the damage. But I think that if we can get, and Mary's done some excellent work, Mary Donna's done excellent work in this area about getting people to understand and how effective this can be. But one of the reasons we did the Pathfinder projects that Steve is running is there's actually barriers not just with the public who may not see this as being beneficial, but also in the professional area, where there's a range of embedded behaviours or ways which industries behave, which actually work against recoverability. You know, the tendency after a flood to come in and rip everything out, for example, because that's what's always been done without thinking, do we need to do this? So obviously what we'd like to do is to see more homes kind of make themselves recoverable and be able to just get on with life afterwards. I know that one reads of cases where people have been back in their homes very quickly after a flood, and with 2 or 3 days sometimes of the actual event, that they've got back to being life as normal. So the busy slide. I sort of wanted to put this up here just to show you how all of these things are connected that I've been talking about, the way how we are kind of taking forward the learning and trying to, and we've done work with people, we've done works on the technology, and we've kind of scoped out the whole area. And I think that government over the past few years has actually managed to set out the stage, and I think that we now have most of the bricks in place for this to happen. So the next step is, how do we get to the next phase, which is where the Business Roundtable comes in to a very large extent, and actually how do we embed what we now know and what we are able to do to make property flood resilience to be regarded with the same level of thought and attention by the public as putting in a fire alarm. Now, the government will hope to publish later this year more details about our approach to tackle flooding and erosion. This will set out our ambition for the next few years, and will cover various schemes and set out what we'd like to achieve. Now, this has been a little bit delayed, but we expect it's going to happen. It should be published quite soon. We also are in the final stages of doing work for a consultation on widest changes to the partnership funding scheme. Now, some of the changes that have been put through after the review in 2018 do mean that it's possible to do more property flood resilience schemes. And I think that hopefully with more, and I've seen that there's more potential out there for almost double the number of schemes that we've done in the first 8 years of PFR into the next spending round. So there's great potential there, but there's also I think that it needs to be coupled with this message to people that they're responsible for it. And of course, one of the risks of giving away free stuff is it's just treated as free stuff and not valued, and it's something Steve alluded to. So we've got to find ways of embedding this into people's homes, their lives, and so they understand it in the same way that people understand how technology or anything works. My example's an iPad. I thought I'd never have one, but nowadays I can't imagine not having one. We've also announced at government that there will be a 5.2 billion, and Emma mentioned this, over the next 6 years. And there's also an additional 200 million over the next 6 years to help 25 local areas take forward wider actions to improve their flood resilience. And that can be a whole range of things for those areas to develop. And the Environment Agency is currently working up a brochure that will be available later in the year for people to bid into. So we've got lots of ideas there in government for taking this forward, but the only way this is going to work is if we can make this part of the sort of thing that local builders, professionals, and various other people are able to tell people about. Property flood resilience is never going to be embedded by a top-down approach. It's never going to change our lives if it relies on government support and government schemes. The only way this is going to become part of the flood resilient kind of infrastructure is if people understand the benefits themselves. And for that, we need your help and your support in taking forward these messages and making them accessible and understandable to people, leaning over garden fences and things like that. One of the things we found in Cumbria in 2015-16 was that the take-up rate of the Property Flood Resilience Grant seemed to shoot up when somebody spotted someone in their street who had spotted the grant taking it up, and they thought, oh, I'll have that too. So there's clearly something out there about how people learn about this and how people take it forward. And at a government level, we can give you the building bricks, but we need you to take this forward at the ground level to make a difference. And thank you very much. That's me, hopefully stirred the pot a bit. Thank you, bye.
That's great. Thank you very much, Robbie. We've got some time to go over to questions that have come in, just while Jane gets that lined up. Perhaps just for my benefit, well, hopefully for everyone's benefit, actually. You've mentioned the Pathfinder projects, Robbie, which we're CIWEM, trying to work as close as we can with in terms of particularly getting the learnings that are coming out from those Pathfinders. I wondered whether you had a view, what's the sort of principal learnings that you're starting to see come through from the 3 Pathfinders?
Well, unfortunately, we had the COVID virus come in just at the point where the projects were starting to deliver, and I think that it's that this local messaging is the key thing that seems to work. Is that people seem to I think one of our earlier research projects kind of learned quite quickly that a message that works in one community will not be the same message working in another community. And it's about this local translation of national messaging into local areas. And also about what's impressed me is actually how imaginative the 3 projects have been. They've all gone down different tracks, which suit the local area, and it's that kind of local understanding of the people you're working with, I think, that is the key thing they brought to this.
Thank you very much. Okay, we're going to move over now to the questions that have come in, and the first question here is, can we force insurance companies to build back better rather than like with like? And of course, you'll be aware that that Flood Re is taking bold sort of declarations in that direction. But just more generally than that, do you think we can actually force insurance companies to allow build back better?
I think if that had been the case, I think we need to work with the insurance industry so that this becomes the way that business is done, rather than force them to do it. I think the problem with forcing is that without standards and without a good framework behind it, you would not end up with anything that's very consistent as a standard. Obviously, we're in that position now, and maybe in the future this is something that can be considered, but I think for the moment we're a long way off that.
Okay, thank you. Right, I mean, one of the things that CIWEM is really concerned about, I think it's really important, is that we promote, obviously, property flood resilience, but also the code of practice that was launched back in February, I think, of this year. And we had several questions that coming through this morning around publicity and getting information out there. And the suggestion here is that maybe we should have a TV program like DIY SOS, but for PFR. actually sort of looking at maybe on a community-wide basis retrofitting a resilience measures. Do you think that's plausible? Is that something that government could actually help to encourage?
I understand there's a chap called Ed Barsley's working on this very concept at the moment. So I think it's a watch our space sort of thing to see, wait for this to happen.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Just a note on that, I mean, CIWEM is, and in fact, until we went into lockdown, we were going to be out in the field filming a series of films which are looking at resilience amongst other things, and we hope to get back to that in due course, but that will give us material that potentially we can put out there, and that's going to involve some of the country file team. So we'll have a reasonable amount of profile, and that's maybe edging in the sort of direction that people are thinking of here this morning. Okay, so the next question is flood recovery grants are excellent, but the availability seems to be very geographical, depending on where media interest is focused. Can this be addressed?
The grants can be obtained through the GIA program by anyone developing a local scheme for a local area where the flood risk meets the guidelines and the gets through the various gateways. In terms of when there's a flood event, the government sometimes, in exceptional circumstances, will make grants available to assist with resilient repair of properties by insurers and householders after an event. Now, we've only done this 3 times: 2013-14, 2015-16, and 2019-2020, and it really is the key word here is exceptional. Whether we do something, a peacetime grant, that's something we might actively consider in the future. But at the moment, the approach that we're taking is that the grant in aid allows local communities to develop schemes for their area, and that's one route that people should take, and obviously does not do recoverable repair, but it sort of sets the direction of travel. The grants are designed for a specific purpose, and they're coupled with grants from BAYS and from MHCLG to assist those people. That's why they're geographically spread the way they are.
Okay, I mean, we see this a lot, don't we? When emotions run high after a particular event in an area, then that tends to invoke a particular response. And those of us that are in the industry and made a career out of it get rather frustrated by that we need, that support to be consistent and available as widespread as possible. And I think what you're saying is that through the grant scheme, that support is available to everybody.
Yeah, pretty much. I think that local authorities can develop their own PFR schemes to apply for grant and aid, either through local levy or for the partnership funding grants, and that's something that they've been able to do for many years, and we hope to see more of them do it in the future. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. And probably just time for one more question quickly on a similar sort of theme. Actually, no, that question's disappeared, so it would be another question. Right, so
okay.
Here we go. Again, a long-standing debate really, that flood risk has become disjointed. People don't care where water comes from, and so get upset when the authorities say, not my flood responsibility. And this is very much something that should be led from the top, isn't it, from government?
Yeah.
So how can this change?
I don't think I can answer this question very easily. I think that the way that flood risk was set out in 2010 after the pit review was actually the first time that responsibilities had been properly defined. And I think that we should start from the premise that before that point, the risk, it wasn't defined who would do particular roles. Now, there are some areas where these roles sort of bit around the edge get frayed, but people should at the first instance go to their local authority which have got the lead local flood authority as the point of contact about their local flood risk, and that should be the point where that should be people's first point of contact. I think it's not, I think it appears disjointed, and I remember going to a seminar in another in Belgium, where different countries were running over the system to manage flood risk. And some of those countries had what appeared to be a rather simpler structure than we have in the United Kingdom. But the actual the people reviewing all these different systems actually said about the UK system is it does seem to work better than some of these systems, because people are responsible for specific areas of where flood risk is managed. And I think that it can be difficult for the public, but I think we need to make more of the fact that the lead local flood authority should be their first point of contact. And of course, I would encourage local communities where there is a big flood risk to take on board that as part of what they do. I know that some parish councils have flood committees who keep this activity live within the authority and actually act as a point of contact for those people. And there are people out, and it's actually those routes which work best, because knowing that there's someone in a community who knows this stuff and knows where to go is probably the best way of making this work. Because I think for technical reasons, the current system, is the best we have at the moment for delivering flood resilience.
Okay, thank you. I mean, this debate will rage on, I think, and CIWEM has been very active in working with government to look at the issue of roles and responsibilities, and we will continue to do so. I have to say, from a personal perspective, I think the sort of collaboration and cooperation and the building of partnership working is something that has improved, maybe despite the frameworks we have in place, but we are seeing a better cooperation, which is of course good to see. Okay, Robbie, I'm afraid we're right out of time, and there's some really good questions still coming through. So again, we'll capture those and perhaps follow up with you afterwards, if that's okay.
Thanks, great. Yep, no worries.
Perfect, thank you. But for now, I'll just say thank you very much to you, and we'll move now quickly on. It's really encouraging to me that there's been several references throughout this morning from all of our speakers reminding us about community and people that are at the sharp end of flood risk implications. And some of those quotes that have been shown this morning, I found really quite moving, actually. Real reminders of how it impacts humanity and people's lives, etc. So it's really great that we can perhaps finish up this morning by turning to our final speaker, Martin Hughes. So Martin is an owner of a Leeds damp proofing and property resilience company, which has completed numerous schemes both locally and nationally, and so been working with people that have experienced flood difficulties. This includes to Martin's own home, which was flooded in 2015, despite the presence of barriers which he reinstated with further resilience measures, and have thus far proved effective. So Martin has got first-hand experience of this. In February 2020, 4 weeks of very high water levels in the River Aire meant that the houses were close to flooding again. However, this did not occur. Water that got into the subfloor voids was successfully pumped out. Martin continues through his company to provide property level flood defence and resilience advice. Martin, it's really great to welcome you this morning, and I look forward to hearing what you have to say now.
Thank you, Terry, and thank you to CIWEM for inviting me to this event. I'm very grateful for being here. I'm going to start talking from some slides, which I'm going to put up, share the screen, and I'm just going to take you through very quickly some of the things which perhaps Emma covered. Just let me find this. So we're starting, I intend to start at a sort of resistance level, and just simply say that the common resistance measures are flood barriers. There are things like air brick covers, and this is one on the house that I have, and also the repointing of seams of stonework or brick which are in the flood zone. This is waterproof pointing. You can see the original pointing above, but the waterproof pointing is below. in this house also, we've installed flood channels. And now, although there are standards for flood panels, PAS 1188, those standards actually allow the panels to leak. Nobody quite understands that, and they think that panels are going to be perfect. Well, they're not. So you must expect there's going to be some water entering. And in this particular case, a solid floor with some channels where water is likely to collect, be directed to a sump and a pump, and hopefully be pumped away by a pump, which hopefully is also going to be automatic so that it triggers itself. And also that if needed, there is some form of battery backup to that. In my case, I'm a bit of a green energy freak. I have a Tesla battery backup, and there is a link between the two houses so that both houses benefit from the backup system offered by that battery. There are also things like air bricks, which are self-closing, so the water arrives and flaps rise and close the air bricks to stop the water entry. Non-return valves in things like washing line drains, washing machine drains, where the drain is likely to be in the zone where water might reach. And finally, the ubiquitous toilet bung, which is not very pleasant to fit, but works very well. So these are the sort of resistance items which I've put into my houses. But I think also it is important to be talking about the resilience measures, because these are the points at which you're going to expect some water entry. And it may be catastrophic, as in my case, where the water came over the top of panels that had been specified to deal with a particular flood level height. In that particular case, it's 400 millimeters. The new panels are now 800 millimeters. I hope next year they don't need to be 1200 millimeters. Anyway, the point of it is that there's quite a lot of things that you can do to build resilience. One of them is to use damp-proof membranes. These are liquid damp-proof membranes, which when applied to solid floors mean that the cleanup is very much quicker and easier. It's completely waterproof. You can hose them down, get rid of excess water fairly quickly. It's different from having an exposed concrete surface. We then have an interesting system of flooring in one of the houses. You can see in that in that photograph, how close we are to the river. And you can see the flooring itself. The two important things to show you here, and a third one to emerge from that. First of all, you can see the full cell insulation which has been used in the floors. Previously, it was rolled fiber insulation, and that got wet and had to be removed. This material is completely 100% waterproof. It cannot get wet. On top of it, the grey material is something called Egger Wayrock Protect. And with its edges sealed with a special glue, it too becomes 100% waterproof. It is one of those products that's used in new builds when they want to continue work at low level and there isn't a roof on the property. You sometimes see a building with no roof, but this has been laid on the upper floors to stop water getting into the main part of the house. The third aspect of this one is cavity wall insulation. These little walls that you see here, dwarf walls, were full of fiber loft insulation. They aren't anymore because the material has now been replaced with a two-part spray, which is, again, completely waterproof and can't get wet. Therefore, if the floodwater gets to the cavity wall insulation, it just simply can't get wet, which is an advantage. The other item to finish all this off, this is the same room, this happens to be aquastep flooring. It is quite expensive and it has a skirting board system, but it's 100% waterproof. And in installing it, these individual sheets of material are all numbered on the back. They can be taken out washed and put back in again if necessary. So these are resistance items which I have worked to. But I think that one of the things that I would like to mention particularly about resistance is the importance of obtaining the earliest possible strip out to recover. What I mean by this is, don't just sit there and let the place rot away. Start getting stuff outside. And a lot of people say, well, you can't do this because the insurance companies want to see what you're doing. Yes, that's fine. Video it then. Take photographs of it. Record it thoroughly, but get the stuff out. It is amazing what you can recover quickly. And in this drawing here, in this photo here, you'll see on the right-hand side some shelving. This is American hard oak, and it got flooded and recovered because it dries out so quickly. It's varnished. It's a very tough wood. It lasts a long time. Obviously, there are other things like kitchen units, but I'm very fond of recycling things. And I encourage people that if they are flooded to get things like electrical sockets. They can come off the wall. They probably will be usable again if dried out carefully. I used 22 stainless steel sockets which had been flooded, cleaned them up and reused them in the house. The value of those alone is in excess of £400. So I'm very keen on recycling materials if you possibly can. Obviously things like plasterboard, you can't recycle them, they've got to go. And they, if you like, are one of those sacrificial items, which is part of the flood repairing flood damage. The last thing I'd like to say is one of the most useful things that I found, £99, is a wet vacuum cleaner. Have one, because if there is some leakage around doors, you can trap it fairly quickly. Finally, three aspects perhaps. First of all, understand your flood risk. Know where your flood risk is from. You can see mine, it's the river outside. What about the local drainage though? We have a combined sewer outlet right next to the house. It's actually linked directly to our sewage drainage system. So we need large non-return valves. The other aspects of it are, what are the drains like in your street? Are they clean? When it floods, does the water run in places that it shouldn't run? Local authorities should be cleaning drains, but in Leeds, for instance, they're now only on a reaction cleaning rota. And so you've got to ask them to do it if you want to protect your property. We've heard a little bit this morning about the maintenance and storage and servicing of especially flood resistant items. And I would encourage everybody to store things correctly and to get the kit out of the cupboard at least once a year, possibly twice a year, and install it. Find out whether it's all right. Find out whether the mice have eaten the foam. It happens, and it's too late to do anything about it when you're fixing these items to prevent a flood risk. The last thing I would like to mention, two other things, is if you're not already in a local flood group, then join one, because it's a source of information, it's a source of help. It is also a source of softening the mental problems caused by flooding, because you get a chance to share those experiences with other people. And the last thing I'm going to have a gripe about very quickly is VAT. VAT is currently charged on all floods equipment at a rate of 20%. This means that our £5,000 grants have become £4,166 plus VAT. I'd rather see all of that money spent on flood prevention equipment for the home, and I encourage the government to reduce the VAT rate, if not to exempt to zero, and if not to zero, 5% like other similar building materials when you're building a new house. And the last thing, just to have a little bit of amusement, these are my flood stores and my flood store copies. The last thing, just to have a little bit of a laugh, is that this is a flood door which has been on for less than 24 hours. It was installed by our sponsors here, White House, and already a cat flap has appeared at the door, which completely negates having it in the first place. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Martin. Oh dear, oh dear. Okay, that's really great. Thanks for showing us some really sort of practical examples, and I find it really encouraging as well. Those measures that you've shown are they just look normal. It's it's attractive, and it's just an integral part of the house now, and it doesn't look like a flood resilient house. And I guess that's quite helpful in trying to encourage people to take these measures on board. Okay, we're going to go straight to some questions. We have a few minutes for those. So the first one, really interesting actually. What was your motivation for change? Can we learn from your empowerment, taking on board, empowering yourself to make a difference? So yeah, I mean, what was it that actually convinced you to take those steps?
Well, the answer is that being flooded is absolutely devastating. It's mentally stressful. It's not something that is pleasant at all. The process of cleaning up afterwards, of dealing with the problems, is life-changing, because you have to start learning a whole lot of skills that you perhaps didn't want to learn. So there's this impetus to say to oneself, well, I've experienced this and I don't want it to happen again. Or if it happens, I'm going to be prepared for it in an extra special way by doing extra things. And the second part of that question I saw was, did I self-fund? And the answer is partly yes. I believe that if you want to save some money in the long run, you've got to spend some money. I think we saw one of the statistics on the slides indicating that money spent on this sort of thing, you get a £5 return for a £1 expenditure. I'm absolutely sure that if you spend some money on some flood barriers and some resistance, and water doesn't come into your house, that is worth it.
Perfect. Okay, and I think, so following on from that then, how could we sell this concept to vulnerable and deprived communities where perhaps those financial resources and technical capabilities aren't quite so readily available?
Yes, I agree. I think the answer is that the vulnerable and deprived communities need to be identified.
Yeah, indeed. Okay, thank you. Right, here's a neat question stroke idea. Is there a role for the EA flood warning system to ensure residents...
Perhaps even the Environment Agency should inject more effort into doing that sort of thing, so that vulnerable areas can be targeted, and that there are then targeted schemes to be able to help people.
Yeah, I mean, this is the sort of fire drill concept, I guess. But one of the earlier comments from today was that people are feeling a bit fatigued by the number of warnings that potentially don't come to anything. So we need to address that, wouldn't we?
Yeah, I mean, this is rather like sort of walking through a door. You walk through a door, and on the other side there's a guy with a boxing glove, and it's really, really nice if you've been told that he might take a swing at you, because if you walk through the door and he does swing at you, you've got every right to say, I wasn't told about this. Flood warnings are tricky because the prediction of exactly what's going to happen isn't perfect. We, during February, were on flood warning virtually for 4 weeks, and it became very wearing. But for us, it was something that signaled that we still had to be careful. We still had to leave the flood doors in position, and we shouldn't take them off, and we should be wandering around making sure that we were prepared if it happened to us. So although I agree with you, the flood warnings are a bit over the top, I feel that they are necessary, and they do give a height of awareness which you perhaps might not otherwise have.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Next question is around the kite marking of products, which the PFR guidance obviously would recommend, but these are usually more expensive. I think the question here is, are the products that you've illustrated this morning, are those compliant with the kite marking? Or are there products out there perhaps that you don't necessarily need to seek the kite mark?
The kite mark is associated with the resistance of panels to letting in water, I believe. And those panels that you saw in my slide do have a kite mark. Unfortunately, kite marking is very expensive. My understanding is that this can cost a manufacturer something like 50 or 60,000 pounds, because there's a lot of testing to do. So that on cost has to be moved to the product. So it's a difficult one, this. Everybody would prefer to see kite marked products in use because standards are important, but something is better than nothing. And getting the best bang for your buck, I think, is also really quite important. But they should work. I mean, you know, you shouldn't buy a flood door and find that it catastrophically leaks. Although, of course, it's very much down to the installation.
Yeah, I mean, I think this whole topic of making sure we've got the right standards of specification, installation, maintenance and operation of
Terry, I think that the surveying of properties by specialist people who know what they're doing, who can identify routes of entry of water into the property and then stop those off one by one and provide the homeowner with a scheme which says, this is the biggest hole, we patch it with this, this is what's going to cost. This is the smaller hole, we patch it with this, this is what it's going to cost. It gives the homeowner absolutely the fullest information. But this is not something which can be done by the man on the street. This requires expert input.
Indeed, yeah. And that leads us into the next question, which is kind of back to the building regulations discussion from earlier, really. In your experience of dealing with local housing authorities, etc., and departments, is this work happening? I mean, is there attempts to sort of to link this into building regulations, etc.?
Yes and no. I mean, I think that in Leeds, for instance, I know that great consideration is given to the building of buildings within flood zones. There's actually a site just opposite us, and the landowner has been required to build up the land substantially to take it out of the flood zone before he can build a house on the piece of land. But in general, I find some of these schemes to be less than satisfactory. We did a huge one in Goole, and this actual site was below the level of the river, and each house was to have fairly rudimentary property level flood defences, like panels and air bricks and things like that. But basically, the next time it really came up, they all flooded because, unfortunately, nobody put on their panels. Nobody put them on correctly. So you have to ask yourself, why build in these dangerous places in the first place?
Yeah, sure. Okay, thanks for that. Probably got time for one, maybe two more questions. I'm going to go down to the question about the level of protection that you aimed to achieve, and was that limited by cost factors or any other practical factors?
What I do for myself, and also if clients want it, is that I essentially risk assess. I mentioned earlier on that it's rather like sort of identifying the big holes and putting something in the way of them, and the holes get smaller and smaller, and generally so does the cost. So I do as much as I can do that I can afford to keep reducing the risk. A very good example of this is you can have a pump, you can have an automatic pump, and you can have an automatic pump with a battery backup. Each one of them reduces the risk of damage occurring from water entry because the pump is able to carry on pumping. But each one carries with it a very significant increased cost.
Yeah, okay. I guess, you know, you could just install measures that can be adapted or adaptable, so you can add these various components.
Oh yes, yes. I mean, the beauty about pumps is that you can buy a pump, you can buy an automatic controller, a little trip switch, and you can buy a battery backup scheme, and you can buy them all separately, and they can be installed quite separately. It's not quite as good because you've got to sometimes create room for these things, and also housing. I mean, battery backup, some of them take up a lot of room, and you need places to be able to put them. So it's better to plan this from the beginning, in my view, and spend the money up front rather than saying to yourself, well, I'll do this 1 year and do this next and do this the year after. But it is down to risk assessment, and it is down to what the homeowner wants to spend themselves, because they've got to put quite a lot of money into this.
Yeah, sure. Okay, that's great. Thank you very much. We're out of time again, I'm afraid. Time is flying. So that was fascinating, Martin, and I really
Thank
hope
you very much.
Continue these conversations and perhaps get some of your thoughts on some of the other work CIWEM is doing over the coming months. That would be really helpful to us, I think. So I'm going to close this morning's webinar now, and I'm going to close it with saying something that perhaps some of you that know our organisation won't necessarily have heard before, or indeed maybe expect me to say this, but CIWEM is, we're a membership body, but we're also a charity. And what that means is that all the activities that we undertake are funded by the revenues that we generate internally through sponsorship, through all sorts of support, through our membership subscriptions. And we have a whole load of commercial activities around our events and training, etc. And all of that money gets put back into member services, as well as helping to push forward things like the PFR initiatives and the code of practice. And we have been, like many organisations, hit extremely hard, and we are facing some quite challenging times ahead. And that coincides with a real desire to make sure that we run webinars such as this one and make them accessible to all, and as far as we can, free to participate in, because we think it's really important that everyone is involved in the conversations that we need to have. But we can't continue to do that without funding, and we have got this challenge that's been added on to us through the COVID-19 experience recently. So if you did enjoy this morning, and I hope you did, I certainly have, and you're able to, and you'd like us to continue with this sort of approach and with this work, then just a small donation to CIWEM would be incredibly helpful to us just now and going forward. Of course, we're incredibly grateful to White House Construction for their support, but it'd be great if we can enhance that, and so we can do more of these webinars. So there is on our website a donate opportunity. Press a button on the website, so please go to that. I think you can see some details up on the screen there in terms of the link to that. Please just give that some thought. If you do feel able, that resource will be put to very good use, I can assure you of that, and we'll be most grateful for your support. So thank you very much. We also really need to and want to hear your feedback. We've got some great questions which we will take away and look at, but any other feedback you can give us about this webinar, the way it's been run, the topics, any ideas for future webinars, really like to hear that. So there's a survey that will take you 2 minutes to complete, which will automatically launch at the end of this webinar. So if you can just stay with us for another 2 minutes after I stop talking, and complete that questionnaire, that would be really helpful as well. So as I said earlier, please do stay in touch. If you're new to CIWEM, please reach out to us. The website's got all sorts of contact details. My email address is quite easy to remember. It's terry.fuller@ciwem.org. I would be delighted to hear from you if you want to know more about CIWEM, and so would any of my colleagues in the central team. So please do get in touch, and my thanks again to all of our speakers. Really fantastic. I've really enjoyed this and learnt an incredible amount. I can't wait till next week's second session. But until then, have a great afternoon. Do stay safe, and we hope to see as many of you as possible at our future events. So thank you very much.